Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Today we're doing a really monumental deep dive into the life, and I think it's fair to say the incredibly controversial work of Omar Khayyam.
And most people know the name, right? They know the Rubaiyat.
Exactly. But this was an 11th and 12th century Persian polymath. Not just a poet. He was a genuinely world-class astronomer who perfected the calendar, a mathematician whose work was, influential for centuries.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really get under the skin of those famous poems. Because Khayyam's Quatrains, the Rubaiyat, they're the site of this profound philosophical war.
They really are. On one side, you have this view of him as a fierce skeptic. Maybe even a proto-atheist who found zero comfort in religious dogma and, well, he chose immediate sensual pleasure instead.
And then the other side claims him as a deeply profound Sufi saint, arguing that all the talk of wine and revelry was just. It was coded language for divine love and spiritual ecstasy.
It's a tension that still rages, and it forces you to ask, was Khayyam this hedonistic, stinging serpent, as the mullahs called him? Or was his entire theology, his philosophy, his morals, was it all ultimately sophistic?
So that's what we're here to do. We're going to unpack the source material that feeds both sides of this really enduring debate about God, existence, and the justification of doubt. We're looking for the true voice of the man who literally dared to argue with his creator.
Okay, so let's start with the man himself, because you can't understand the dissent without first understanding his authority. This wasn't some outsider lobbing critiques.
Right. The sources make it very clear. He wasn't just casually educated. We're talking about someone intensely learned in the law, in classical Arabic, in history, and especially in science.
Absolutely. His intellectual stature is the foundation for everything that follows. He was operating at the absolute highest level of the Islamic Golden Age. There's this one fantastic anecdote that just perfectly establishes his authority, and this was long before his poetry made him famous internationally.
Okay, let's hear it, because credibility is everything when you're about to challenge religious orthodoxy from the inside.
So the story involves the vizier, a man named Abdur-Razzaq, who was also the chief of the Quran readers. Imagine the scene. The vizier is in the middle of this heated theological debate with another scholar, Abu Hassan al-Ghazali, about, a major discrepancy in how to interpret a certain verse in the Quran.
A pretty high-stakes argument.
Immensely high stakes. And right in the middle of it, Omar Khayyam, who's still a relatively young man, walks into the room. The vizier immediately stops the argument, points straight at Omar and says, "Here we have the authority."
Wow. Not an authority, the authority.
Exactly. And he deferred to Khayyam to settle the entire matter. That level of deference in that community, which is so centered on religious scholarship, it shows he was seen as an intellectual arbiter, not just some smart guy.
That's just staggering credibility. So, like you said, he wasn't an outsider throwing grenades. He was a master architect who knew the building he was questioning inside and out. And his life then gets tangled up with immense power and incredible danger.
Right, through the famous friendship triad.
This story is almost legendary.
It really is. It connects the pursuit of knowledge directly with, the pursuit of world domination. You have Khayyam on one side, then you have Nizam ul-Mulk, who would go on to become this incredibly powerful and influential vizier.
And a third.
The third is the ill-fated Ben Saba. He becomes the founder and head of the Nizari Ismaili state, which we know better as the feared order of the assassins.
And they all swore an oath as students, promising that whoever found fortune first would share it equally with the others.
And Nizam ul-Mulk, to his credit, made good on that vow when he became the Sultan's chief administrator. He was true to his word.
But the other two friends took very different paths with that offer.
Very different. Ben Saba, the future assassin leader, he demanded a position in government. He got it, but he was far too ambitious, too discontented with the slow rise, and he just plunged headfirst into court intrigue.
And it didn't end well for him.
Not at all. He was eventually disgraced and had to flee. And that's when he goes off and forms this murderous cult that would haunt the entire region for years. And the real tragedy, Nizam ul-Mulk, the vizier, he eventually became a victim of his own childhood friend's legacy.
He was killed by one of the assassins.
He was one of their countless victims, killed by a dagger from the very order his friend created.
The stakes were literally life and death, power and empire.
Right.
But the thing that really stands out to me, the thing that defines our man, is what Omar Khayyam shows when he went to the vizier to claim his share.
Yes.
He explicitly refused title or office. He didn't want the power, didn't want the intrigue or the danger.
And that refusal is maybe the single most telling detail we have about his priorities. Khayyam's request was just to live peacefully, in a corner under the shadow of the vizier's protection so he could pursue science,
Specifically astronomy.
especially astronomy, where the sources say he reached very high preeminence. All he asked for was a yearly pension of 1,200 mithqals of gold.
Let's pause on that number for a second. 1,200 mithqals. What does that mean for a listener today? What kind of life did that buy him in the 11th century?
Well, a mithqal was a unit of weight for gold, so this was a very significant and, crucially, a guaranteed income. It was more than enough wealth to give him complete freedom from the day-to-day business of just earning a living.
He wasn't chasing influence. He was buying intellectual freedom.
That's it, exactly. That pension allowed him the detachment he needed to do the kind of abstract and often, controversial philosophical and scientific work that would come to define him. He chose the quiet life of inquiry over the treacherous path of statecraft.
Which sets up this profound intellectual conflict perfectly. Khayyam has the time, the freedom, and the sheer brain power to question absolutely everything. And the sources say he was tortured with the question of existence.
Tortured.
And that he found no solution to life in the accepted religious teachings of the era.
Precisely. His deeply analytical mind was just. It was left completely dissatisfied by the theological dogma of his time. He's described as smiling ironically at what he saw as the inconsistencies, the peculiarities of the Islam that the mullahs were practicing.
And that kind of attitude, that lack of blind faith, especially within the dogmatic Shiite community, that makes you enemies.
Fast, instantly, they branded him a stinging serpent.
A serpent, because he was stinging the established order with his questions. He wasn't just dissatisfied. He was actively challenging the system from a position of real authority. And central to his entire philosophical despair, the absolute core of his skepticism, is this concept of deterministic fate.
The unshackleable steps of destiny. This idea of determinism is the engine for his entire intellectual protest. Khayyam looks at the Muslim doctrine of predestination. He takes it to its absolute logical and terrifying conclusion.
Which is?
If God is truly all-powerful, then God has to be the author of every single act. The human will isn't free. The sources quote his Quatrains that state this emphatically. God is the author of the acts of the human race. It is he who controls the will of man, which is not free in its action.
That's total control. There's no room for free will there. Human agency just vanishes, and it's replaced by this divine pre-written script. But how does the poetry get that feeling across, that sense of, crushing helplessness?
Through these unforgettable, almost desperate images. The most famous one, of course, is the checkerboard metaphor. That's Quatrain X. He sees the whole world as a cosmic game.
Let's hear it.
"'Tis all a checkerboard of nights and days, where destiny with men for pieces plays, hither and thither moves and mates and slays, and one by one back in the closet lays."
Wow. That completely changes the relationship between God and humanity. We're not participants in that vision. We are objects.
We're chess pieces.
We're moved, we're mated, and then we're just laid back in the box without any say in our own fate whatsoever.
And this sense of irreversible finality, it's captured just as powerfully in that other famous image, the pre-written decree. Quatrain Li. This is the one that gets quoted everywhere when people talk about fate.
The moving finger.
Yes. The moving finger writes, and, having writ, moves on. "Nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it."
That is a devastating symbol of predetermination. It's just relentless, it's unstoppable, and it's completely uncaring. So this isn't just an observation he's making about fate, it's a complaint. It's an intellectual protest.
It has to be.
Because if every move is already written, if every sin is dictated from on high, then any punishment that follows is fundamentally unjust.
And that's it. That is the profound conclusion that drives Khayyam into full-blown rebellion. It's the idea that the system of punishment is morally corrupt if determinism is absolute. And that moves us seamlessly into the next phase of his poetry, his direct confrontation with the creator over the question of justice.
Exactly. I mean, if we are just pieces and the game is fixed, then the player can't turn around and blame the piece for being moved incorrectly. This is the absolute heart of the protest, especially for those who see him as the ultimate skeptic. He basically takes on the role of a lawyer, arguing a case against divine justice.
He does. He transforms his poetry into a series of these incredibly defiant rhetorical questions, and he aims them directly at God. The most powerful ones challenge the creator on accountability. He's essentially saying, you set the traps, and now you're blaming me for falling into them.
Let's look at Quatrain Foliade,
Yeah.
because it just perfectly embodies that challenge.
Okay. O thou who didst with pitfall and with gin beset the road I was to wander in, thou wilt not with predestination round enmesh me and impute my fault to sin.
That is a massive theological accusation. Khayyam is saying, look, I accept the doctrine of predestination, but if it's true, how could you possibly punish me? He collapses the entire legal and moral framework of the era by making God the ultimate designer of both the sin and the snare.
He just shifts the moral responsibility entirely off of humanity's shoulders. And so the poet who questions destiny is, by extension, questioning the very nature of divine morality. And this audacity reaches its absolute peak in what some people consider the most radical challenge in the entire Rubaiyat.
Quatrain LXX1, the famous one about forgiveness.
Yes. O thou who man of baser earth didst make, and who with Eden didst devise the snake, for all the sin wherewith the face of man is blackened, man's forgiveness give and take.
Man's forgiveness give and take. I mean, that is just breathtaking. It isn't just asking God for forgiveness. He's demanding a reciprocal exchange. If the Creator intentionally designed the system with temptation built in, devised the snake, then he is at least partially responsible for the sin that followed. And therefore, the Creator should seek forgiveness from his own creation.
It's a complete theological reversal. It's a protest so profound it just shatters the traditional power dynamic between God and man. It challenges the very idea of divine perfection, especially when you couple that perfection with absolute control and the deliberate introduction of temptation or, a flawed design.
And the sources really back this up. They note that Khayyam might as well be saying 10,000 mortals drowned in endless woe for doing what they were compelled to do. He completely rejects the justice of punishing a creation that is fundamentally flawed by its very design.
And this philosophical idea, the injustice of a flawed design, he develops it into one of the most brilliant and enduring extended metaphors in all of world literature.
The metaphor of the potter's shop, the Kuzanama.
Or the Kuzanama. This is where his critical thinking and his deterministic fatalism find their most powerful, their most artistic expression.
The image is just so incredibly vivid. You have Khayyam alone in a potter's shop, surrounded by all these clay vessels, this clay population, and then the pots, which symbolize humanity, they suddenly come to life and start interrogating their maker.
It's the perfect setting for his protest, isn't it? The vessels are literally made of earth, which reflects the creation stories in the Quran and the Bible, and they're all discussing their physical destiny. The Kuzanama is this incredible exercise in critical thinking, moving this abstract theological question of determinism into a tangible physical place.
So what are the specific questions the pots are asking? It's not just, why were we made? They're questioning the fundamental logic of their own existence.
Well, first they challenge the very definition of identity. They ask simply, who is the potter, pray, and who the pot? They're trying to understand the hierarchy, the relationship. If we're all made from the same earth, what really separates the creator from the created?
They also seem to challenge the wastefulness of it all. There's a beautifully made vessel that questions why so much intricate effort was put into its form, only to be broke or trampled back to shapeless earth again.
And that speaks directly to the human experience of purpose and loss. Why do we invest so much? In science, in art, in love, in building a life, only to return to shapeless earth. The implication is that a purposeless creation, followed by destruction, is just a monumental divine waste.
It's an ecological and a moral complaint all wrapped into one.
It is. But the most devastating line, the one that perfectly encapsulates Khayyam's defense against judgment, it comes from the flawed vessel, the ungainly one.
This is where the metaphor really becomes a tool.
It becomes a social and theological tool, yeah. It's defending the marginalized, the sinner, the outcast. The flawed pot gives the ultimate defense against both divine and societal judgment in Quatrains of Omar. It says, "They sneer at me for leaning all awry. What? Did the hand then of the potter shake?"
The sneerers. Those are the religious authorities, the moralists of his time, the ones judging anyone who fails to conform to dogma. And Khayyam just turns that judgment right back on the source.
He does.
If the creation is imperfect, if I'm a sinner, if I'm leaning all awry, the fault isn't mine. The ultimate responsibility for any flaw rests with the Creator, with the potter.
It's a complete justification for fatalism that leads directly to protest. Khayyam is insisting that if we are molded by destiny, then our flaws are designed flaws. And if they're designed, they cannot be justly punished. This isn't just skepticism anymore. This is a revolutionary reframing of sin itself as a structural, unavoidable part of existence.
And this relentless skepticism, it doesn't just stop with the flaws of humanity. He extends it to the entire cosmos. Khayyam looks at the universe itself and sees it as equally subject to this destiny.
Which he illustrates with that powerful image of the inverted bowl.
The heavens, right? That inverted bowl we call the sky. He sees it as this vast, uncaring structure where under crawling cooped we live and die. It's a profoundly claustrophobic vision of the world.
It really is. And if the sky is supposed to represent the celestial order, the source of light and guidance, his conclusion about its power is bleak.
What does he conclude?
He concludes it offers zero solace, zero help. His analysis is that the heavens themselves are just a bigger creation, also trapped within the same confines of fate. They're just as helpless as we are.
So he warns us.
He warns, "Lift not thy hands to it for help, for it rolls impotently on as thou or I."
So the ultimate conclusion of all his astronomical and philosophical study is that the universe is vast, deterministic, and fundamentally indifferent. If there's no justice from the Creator and no guidance from the heavens, then all that's left is the immediate, tangible world.
Exactly. And that shift in focus is what leads us to this massive interpretive challenge, the great hermeneutic divide.
This is where the two Khayyams, the two completely opposing versions of him, come into play.
Because if you've intellectually exhausted every route to divine certainty and all you've found is this deterministic fatalism, well, one logical conclusion is to just abandon the spiritual struggle entirely and turn to the present moment.
And this is the view that was championed by early Western critics, right? People like von Hammer and Renan.
Yes, they saw him as the Epicurean skeptic, the man who, having failed of finding any providence but destiny and any world but this, just decided to maximize the enjoyment of today, to soothe the soul through the senses.
And he certainly gives them plenty of clear evidence for that literal interpretation. He champions pleasure. He actively rejects abstract theological thought.
He famously declares that he has divorced old barren reason from my bed and took the daughter of the vine to spouse. Reason is barren, pleasure is life-giving.
And the focus is entirely on the immediate. The past and the future are just dismissed as useless anxieties. He asks, unborn tomorrow and dead yesterday, why fret about them if today be sweet? It's a radical, defiant call for carpe diem.
And the sources confirm that this anti-dogmatic stance was absolutely deliberate and, frankly, offensive to the religious establishment. It says Khayyam was especially hated and dreaded by the Sufis, whose practice he ridiculed. He wasn't a man who would hide his anti-orthodoxy behind ambiguous language.
But this is exactly where the second camp steps in with the Sufi defense. Later Persian scholars, translators like Nicholas, they argue that we have to read this entire body of work as an allegory.
Right.
They claim Khayyam was a high Sufi master, and his language, far from being hedonistic, is purely spiritual.
This Sufi interpretation, it serves a couple of purposes. First, it legitimizes Khayyam within a religious framework, which was, important. And second, it allows his incredibly potent language to be absorbed safely into spiritual tradition. They argue that his skepticism was just a rhetorical device to shock the reader into deeper thought.
So what are the specific symbolic definitions they use? How do they transform these very sensual physical terms into spiritual ones?
Yeah.
We need to unpack that code.
They map out the vocabulary very precisely. So when Khayyam talks about wine, they say he's really referring to a dufin, a direct knowledge of God, or the intense love of God.
So if he's drinking wine, he's actually receiving divine enlightenment.
That's the idea. And the wine shop, then, that becomes the Murshidi Kamil, the perfect spiritual director or guide. His heart is the place where this divine love and knowledge is stored. So the physical setting is replaced by the spiritual journey.
And what about the tools, the wine cup itself?
The cup becomes the telkin, the declaration of faith, or the very words of divine knowledge that flow from the spiritual director's mouth to the disciple. Even something as sensual as the sweetheart's ringlets is spiritualized.
What does that become?
It civilizes the grateful praises of the preceptor, which serve to bind the student's affections to the spiritual path.
So this whole interpretation, it transforms Khayyam from this dangerous skeptic into a preacher of moral purity and of a contemplative life, someone who's just struggling to master the eternal, the good, and the beautiful. But I have to ask, given that the sources explicitly state that he ridiculed the Sufis, how credible is this defense?
That is the core conflict.
It sounds a bit like an effort to save a brilliant but politically dangerous poet from himself, doesn't it?
It certainly acts as a necessary shield. In a society where open questioning could lead to charges of heresy, and don't forget, Khayyam lived under the shadow of the assassins, claiming his work was allegory was a very politically astute move. But Fitzgerald, the great English translator who made the Rubaiyat famous, he was highly skeptical of this.
Fitzgerald pointed out that the philosophical doctrines that Khayyam is expressing, things like pantheism, materialism, necessity, they weren't exclusive to Sufism. They were just the very original irreligion of thinking men from the first.
Exactly. They were markers of intellectual independence, not necessarily Sufi mysticism. And Fitzgerald delivered the ultimate practical objection that just completely undermines the allegorical reading. He anchored the spiritual debate firmly back in the physical world.
How did he do that?
He pointed to the quatrain where Khayyam expresses his final wishes. He asks that after he dies, his body be washed in literal wine and buried in a vine leaf shroud.
Wait, if the wine is purely spiritual, how do you wash a physical body with it?
That's the devastatingly simple question Fitzgerald asks. Were the wines spiritual, for instance? How wash the body with it when dead? If Khayyam is serious about using literal wine for his funeral, it suggests one of two things.
Either the wine was meant to be literal all along,
Or Khayyam was intentionally creating an unsolvable ambiguity to mock both the literalists and the mystics.
and that ambiguity is his genius. It's his shield. It lets him deliver these devastating anti-dogmatic messages while also giving his defenders an out. Whether he meant it that way or not, his poetry just operates on these two levels simultaneously.
It does. A revolutionary call to material pleasure on one hand, and a possible path of deep spiritual yearning on the other. But here's the thing. Regardless of which interpretation you accept, skeptic or Sufi, they both converge on the same unavoidable philosophical point.
The fleeting nature of life.
Exactly. The materialist and the contemplative both have to deal with the certainty of annihilation. Which brings us to Khayyam's philosophy of the now carpe diem and the void.
This focus on today, it all comes from this profound realization that all human endeavor, all glory, all striving, it's all temporary. And he contrasts the pomp of the past with the silence of the present with haunting effectiveness.
The imagery he uses, it turns these grand historical figures into immediate, poignant warnings. He takes the great kings of Persian history, symbols of ultimate earthly power and luxury, and he just reduces them to dust in a single scene.
You see these great kingdoms just fading. The noise is replaced by silence.
The lion and the lizard keep the courts where Jemshid gloried and drank deep, and Bahram, that great hunter, stamps o'er his head and he lies fast asleep.
Jemshid, the king splendid, who had a cup of eternal life, and Bahamgur, the great hunter. Their legacies are just a lizard crawling in the dust of a ruined palace and a wild ass stamping over a forgotten grave. It's the ultimate reduction of power to nothing.
And the conclusion he draws from this is stark. Life is short. Its ultimate destination is certain annihilation. He calls this end the dawn of nothing.
So he urges action. The caravan draws to the dawn of nothing. Oh, make haste. The time for seeking pleasure or knowledge or love is right now, before the journey is over.
And the certainty of annihilation forces Khayyam to engage with mortality not as some spiritual transition, but as a purely physical transformation. The constant return of the dead as living matter. This idea of metempsychosis, the deep connection between human life and the soil, it's a constant theme in the Rubaiyat.
This connects back so beautifully and morbidly to the potter's shop, doesn't it? The human body returns to the clay of the earth. It reinforces the idea that we are just physical components in a larger, relentless cycle.
He paints this poetic picture of the natural world literally feeding off the forgotten dead. The famous image of the rose is so evocative here. He suggests its redness isn't just a color, it's the physical residue of human life.
Never blows so red the rose as where some buried Caesar bled.
And then there's that gentle warning to tread lightly on the delicate herb growing by the riverbank because, who knows, from what once lovely lip it springs unseen. It's this constant visceral reminder that the very ground we walk on is composed of the people who came before us.
This physical connection is so central that he has this final poignant wish for a kind of physical revival. That if a flagon were made from his clay after he died and was filled with wine,
it will live again. It's a desire for a functional continuation, even if it's only as a vessel for the very pleasure he championed in life.
So if the end is this physical annihilation, it's only logical that Khayyam would reject the promises of an afterlife. The houris, the rivers of wine, the external rewards of heaven. He just dismisses the whole theological apparatus of striving for some future reward.
He dismisses any kind of future certainty as pure folly. He has this image of a muezzin, a caller to prayer, but he's calling from a tower of darkness, and he's shouting this devastating message to all the striving believers. Fools! Your reward is neither here nor there.
That's the ultimate agnostic position. All the energy you spend preparing for a theoretical heaven or trying to avoid a theoretical hell is just wasted effort because the entire promise is an illusion.
And Khayyam knew this position came at a cost. He understood the ultimate futility of all this philosophical searching, especially in an era of intense and, frankly, dangerous intellectual debate. All the learned scholars, all the saints and sages who spent their lives discussing of the two worlds so learnedly, they all ended up in the same place.
Thrust like foolish prophets forth, their words to scorn are scattered and their mouths are stopped with dust. That image, the silenced mouth of the scholar, is Khayyam's final word on the limits of human knowledge when it comes to the divine.
And it leads to his defining moment of intellectual humility. Or resignation, maybe. After all the vigorous debate and searching he did in his youth, the result was pure agnosticism. He sought knowledge from the most learned people, but he never found a key.
It's that famous summary of his entire intellectual journey.
Myself, when young, did eagerly frequent Doctor and Saint and heard great argument about it and about, but evermore came out by the same door as in I went.
He started with questions, he argued passionately, and he ended up exactly where he began, uncertain. And that failure to find answers is what compels his preference for immediate, tangible experience. He values a single moment of perceived truth.
Whether it's literal or metaphorical, yeah. One glimpse of it within the tavern caught better than in the temple lost outright.
The agnostic philosopher has exhausted every logical path to the divine and found them all wanting. So he chooses the cash in hand, the certainty of the now over the distant drum of theoretical future promises. And this is why his poetry remains a cornerstone of philosophical protest.
So we come back to the core challenge of this deep dive. How do we synthesize these contradictions? How do we reconcile the brilliant astronomer, the precise scientist who fixed the calendar, with the despairing poet who seems to be advising us to just drink away all our philosophical problems?
The sources suggest his internal struggle was just immense. They describe his soul as being swayed hither and thither by his poetic faculties, which were acted on by a profound intelligence and a wit as cutting as the tulwar of a Persian soldier. His poetry is a philosophical battlefield.
The scientist and the hedonist are at war within him.
It's a profound illustration of a divided soul. The comparison the sources make to the Roman poet Lucretius is really insightful here.
It is. Both Khayyam and Lucretius had these subtle, strong intellects and hearts passionate for truth and justice, and they both justly revolted from their country's false religion. But their responses were different. Lucretius, he settled into this kind of philosophical severity, trying to build a whole new system based on materialism.
Whereas Khayyam was more desperate or more careless.
Exactly. He didn't build a new system. He tore down the existing one and laughed while he did it. Khayyam flung his own genius and learning with a bitter or humorous jest into the general ruin. He used sensual pleasure, or at least the language of it, as the new, serious purpose of life, just to divert himself from the impossible problems of deity and destiny.
And yet, we can't just ignore the counterargument. The Sufi perspective that tries to unify all these contradictions. That argument insists that all his reckless language is resolved when you understand Sufism in its highest sense as the unifying notion for wholeness, love, truth, and power.
The idea that the chaos, the why, and the doubt, it's all just a deliberate pedagogical mask, a teaching tool.
And this idea leads to the radical Sufi concept that the entire theological landscape is internal. Heaven and hell aren't places you go to. They are states of mind you inhabit.
It internalizes everything. There's a quatrain that says, tablet and pen and heaven and hell are within thyself. Heaven is described not as a destination, but as a moment of time when I am tranquil. And hell is just a spark for my useless worries. If reward and punishment are internal states, the whole struggle shifts from obeying external dogma to achieving internal peace.
So under that lens, Khayyam's powerful skepticism, his anti-authoritarian protest, it just becomes a necessary part of the spiritual journey, a magic shadow show intended to illustrate the awakening of the soul through doubt and intellectual challenge.
It's a compelling attempt to absorb the rebellion, for sure, but ultimately the sources seem to suggest that Khayyam was too intellectually honest for that kind of convenient ambiguity. When you synthesize the man and the poet, his preference for clarity really shines through.
He preferred Epicurean audacity over the cloudy spiritual compositions of his contemporaries. The sources note that later poets like Hafiz, they freely borrowed Khayyam's material, the wine, the lover, the tavern.
All of it.
But they turned it to a mystical use that was more convenient to themselves and the people they addressed.
Hafiz could float luxuriously between heaven and earth on that ambiguity. It made his poetry safe, widely acceptable. Khayyam, though, he was too honest of heart and head to fully commit to that kind of compromise. He put his neck on the line.
His life's goal, even in his documented final moments of prayer, it was simple. It was to comprehend the one God, the infinite, whom he had been striving to comprehend with all the strength of his mind and heart.
And whether he found him, or whether he only found intoxicating doubt, that journey was marked by this uncompromised intellectual fervor.
And that uncompromising intellectual fervor is why Khayyam is still absolutely essential today. His Rubaiyat forces us to confront the deepest, most uncomfortable philosophical questions. The tension between predestination and free will, the deterministic potter and the flawed pot, and that crucial choice between seizing the known present versus waiting for the promised unknown future.
It forces you to ask, do you accept the framework of reward and punishment set forth by this inscrutable, all-controlling deity? Or do you stand defiantly with Khayyam and demand accountability? Or, failing that, do you just choose to celebrate the fleeting existence that you are guaranteed to have right now? His challenge to the reader, it just transcends time.
The sources, specifically Quatrain XXV, they give us a really sobering reminder of where all this relentless philosophical seeking can end. It tells us that many sages who dedicated their lives to discussing the two worlds, heaven and earth, were eventually thrusts like foolish prophets forth. Their words to scorn are scattered, and their mouths are stopped with dust.
So if all the theological debate ends only in silence, then the philosophical value of today just skyrockets, doesn't it?
And that is the provocative thought we want to leave you with, and it's anchored in Khayyam's own conclusion. If the pursuit of eternal, ultimate certainty ultimately just results in a mouth stopped with dust, what temporary, tangible pleasure, a shared meal, a moment of deep connection, a quiet insight can you seize today that the universe cannot later take back?
It speaks directly to that famous Quatrainic 7, the image of a simple, immediate paradise that requires nothing more than what's right in front of you. A loaf of bread beneath the bough, a flask of wine, and thou. And wilderness is paradise enow. Embrace that momentary pleasure, because that much, at least, is absolutely certain.
Until the next deep dive, keep questioning the potter and celebrating the now.
Thank you for thinking deeper with us.